Hey everyone, Nubkeks here. As you all know, the beta for Classic WoW is live, and Classic WoW is one of the big topics of conversation and the big sources of hype for a lot of people right now at the moment, and I think with very good reason as well. It's an absolutely fantastic game. What I want to do in this video, though, is dive into what is amusingly one of the most controversial topics when it comes to modern WoW versus Classic WoW, which is more difficult, which is the harder game. I certainly think it's a funny question to look at from the angle of why people feel that one game is or isn't better, or to put it actually more accurately, like why people fight so strongly and stick so solidly by one side of the fence or the other. I think the question of why people feel that way or think that way is truly an interesting one, but beyond the scope of this video. What I'm going to do instead is dive into some examples of which is more difficult in terms of leveling, dungeons, raids, and PvP as well, just to give you, have a bit of a discussion about which I think is the one to be a bit more scared of. So, without any further ado, let's dive in. Okay, well, the first major area of difficulty, which goes without question to Classic WoW, is in the leveling. At a very simple level, and I'm going to put some leveling footage in the background of this video from when I played the Classic WoW demo that's coming back from BlizzCon, doing a Dwarf Paladin on the Alliance side, questing experience through Westfall. I also throw up some stuff from Warlords of Draenor, where I'm currently, well, I'm finished, but I was powering through with an enhancement shaman, doing a bit of a speed run, so you can kind of compare the two from a gameplay perspective. But at a very simple level, what you'll notice straight away in Classic WoW, there's no quest on the minimap, there's no arrow pointing you where to go. There's also no strict quest hub design. That's a big deal as well. You literally have to sit down, you have to read the quest text and work out where it's going to push you. Whereas in modern WoW, quests are typically in very linear, well, not linear, but very intuitive hubs. You're very much shuttled from one area to the other, and it's nearly always extremely clear exactly where you have to go and what you have to do, and you rarely have to go very far out of your way at all. Everything kind of lines up very, very naturally. Not so with Classic WoW, where you can have quests that could send you all over the place. You could be sent back to the same area multiple times, etc., etc. It's not necessarily that helpful at all. On top of this, of course, mobs are far more dangerous relative to your strength. You're probably only going to be able to pull 1 or 2 mobs at a time. If you pull more than that, there's an extremely high chance that you'll simply die. You won't be able to beat them. Long-form crowd control, things like Polymorph, for example, or Sap, can play a crucial role for a lot of classes in actually being able to go through enemy strongholds and be able to beat these mobs. You need these abilities simply to be able to deal with some packs effectively. You take so much damage from the mobs that you're going to have to stop and have food or drink after each fight. You have to think about that as well. When you're pulling the mobs, you have to make sure that you're pulling the right number. Then you have to make sure that you're able to heal up and progress in further without pulling any mobs while you're in that vulnerable state, right? On top of that as well, there's of course, no mount until level 40, and the mount is expensive, so it's a lot slower to get around. It's a lot slower to get in and out of areas compared to what the experience in most situations is nowadays for modern WoW, where you're going to have a flying mount most of the time. Of course, every expansion, there's a couple of major patches before that comes in, but it's about to come in for BFA in the next couple of months, and after that point, everyone's going to be flying around, making all that leveling way easier as well. You also it just took a lot more time to level up in Classic, and I think a big part of this too as well, you put all that stuff together, and World PvP is a lot more common. When you take away some of the sharding, etc. as well, and you have the servers just being servers, but the slower pace of questing, you're in zones for a lot longer, it takes a lot longer to level. It's just a whole different mindset, I feel like, when it comes to World PvP, where instead of in modern WoW, when you're running around questing, engaging in PvP, just say, why bother? It's a waste of time. It's more of a hassle. I've played on PvP servers forever, and in the recent past, for the most part, what everyone does is simply run past each other. I can remember that very clearly from powering up some alts at the end of Legion, for example, with Legion invasions. Literally everyone just runs past each other, Alliance and Horde. We just ignore each other. Nobody wants to take the time or waste the time. Whereas, of course, in Classic, PvP plays a much bigger role. You're in those zones for a long time. The questing is perhaps not as engaging. Certainly, you're not in as much of a race to endgame. The journey is a much bigger part of the game. And I think in that sort of situation, that world PvP becomes an actually interesting distraction for a lot of people. It's something that's kind of fun to engage in, and you're not in this race to get as much experience as possible and just get out of these questing zones and get to endgame and start engaging in that. You don't feel like you're losing out on as much. So certainly my experience back in the day was that PvP was much more common, and I'm hoping and expecting very much so that it will be once again in Classic. I've already seen on streams the battles have busted out around Tarren Mill again. It's all going down already, so expect to see much more of that. But yeah, BFA in comparison, and you'll see that when you compare the footage here, so much more intuitive, so much more forgiving as you quest around. You don't have to stop for food or drink. It's much faster to get around. Mobs are easy to kill, and you're going to tear through them very quickly. I feel like the biggest question oftentimes when you're leveling in Modern WoW, when you're looking at your cooldowns, it's not, ooh, do I need my cooldown to beat this pack, or how careful do I have to be without my cooldowns? It's more of a situation of going, okay, I've got this 2-minute cooldown. Can I simply pull enough mobs at once to make this valuable? Is there enough stuff in range? Can I tag it all and get it on top of me quickly enough to actually get enough value out of this? Like, it's a very, very different mindset. Now, what I will say though is that when you look at this leveling difficulty, it isn't particularly skill based, right? You know, having to stop to eat or drink and taking longer to get around, not very skill based. There obviously is some skill with it, but not a whole ton. Same thing with the mobs being more difficult. It's rarely due to you're doing crazy stuff. It's just they hit really hard, you hit really hard. There's not that many mechanics, but it is difficult. What I will say is that although it's not overly skill-based, it is still very compelling, and that is, for me, I think the most crucial thing here. The difficulty, the time that it takes is very compelling. It creates an immensely strong sense of immersion and of community. Not even a strong sense, it actually, a strong reality. It does create a very strong level of immersion and a very strong level of community. Even within playing less than an hour, within 20 minutes, within half an hour, I can't even remember what it was now, but of playing Classic WoW, I'd already talked to more people in the game, grouped up with more people, cooperated, collaborated, than I probably did in the entirety of leveling through BFA. Actually, that's a lie. I leveled with my guild at the start. We all stayed up for a late night leveling session. That's a total lie. But nonetheless, I think a lot of people, you get the idea. It's in terms of, let me put it like this, in terms of meeting up with strangers, so much more, so many more interactions. And it was a much more difficult leveling experience as well. So without question, this one goes to Classic WoW. The leveling, far more difficult, and I think it works very well on a number of different levels. Next up, we have dungeons. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting, right? Because immediately, you look at a dungeon in Classic WoW. All right, the Dead Mines is the Dead Mines. You look at a dungeon in BFA, let's say a Tal Dazar. Well, a Tal Dazar has a normal difficulty, a heroic difficulty, mythic difficulty, and then mythic keystones all the way from level 1, scaling infinitely. You can keep going as much as you want. So I think very clearly then, this one is, there's a couple of ways to break it down. The first way, of course, is that without question, BFA will ultimately have the more difficult dungeons. Modern WoW in general just has ultimately the more difficult dungeons. That's just what an infinitely scaling difficulty of Mythic Keystone means. Okay? You can very easily just keep doing keys until you will literally get dungeons that are impossible for you to complete, right? That you can practice, become immensely skilled, and you can see that in the Mythic Dungeon International as well, the immense amount of skill these guys have. But you will eventually get something that's too hard, right? So that's just the way it works. So BFA just wins by default, right? Well, yes and no. It does technically. I think the more interesting question, however, is the second way to look at it, which is at which level of difficulty of dungeon in BFA do we compare back to Classic WoW? I think that's a much more interesting question, and I don't necessarily have a strict answer. I will certainly say from my experience across Classic WoW and, of course, more modern WoW, I would say that dungeons, leveling dungeons, let's start with that. Leveling dungeons, I think unquestionably goes to Classic WoW. Leveling dungeons, normal level dungeons in modern WoW are extremely easy. Again, they're designed to be quick, forgiving, intuitive, to just go in, spend 20 or 30 minutes with a bunch of strangers, even if they know absolutely nothing about the game and are playing terribly, that you will still get through with almost no deaths or wipes, and you just kind of sail through, and it will be nice and easy and quick. That's kind of the design goal. Classic WoW did not have that at all. I feel like the dungeons in Classic WoW are a much higher difficulty than that. Again, going through the dungeons in Classic, they're often much bigger as well. They're typically bigger dungeons. They take longer to do. They're bigger, sprawling. I feel like whereas in Modern WoW, the dungeons are very much a race, literally so, in Mythic Plus, where you are fighting against a timer, or fighting on leaderboards to beat other players at top Mythic Keystone levels. Though, of course, most players don't engage in that high level of play. But you're literally going against a timer. It is a race. In Classic WoW, it's not a race at all. It's just simply a case of can we defeat this dungeon? So you're going much slower. Again, I feel like in Classic WoW, I don't feel like it is the case in Classic WoW, that, again, in terms of mechanics, mobs, bosses typically don't have a whole lot of mechanics. Very few. Trash mobs very often have no mechanics at all. It's just tank and spank. Bosses often very similar, or they might have one mechanic. There's not a whole lot going on in terms of mechanics. Typically, the difficulty, again, will come in pulling mobs intelligently, pulling smaller mob packs, using, again, that long-form CC, like polymorphs or saps and whatnot. So I guess sap has, isn't it, you have a talent into it, and it only has a 90% chance to not knock you out of stealth. So there's a 10% chance when you sap something, you're going to get knocked out of stealth. You know, that's a level of difficulty. That's another kind. But yeah, it's more about CCing those mobs and pull them in, right? I think compared to dungeons in BFA, certainly if we leave aside the lower difficulties for a second and we look at those higher level Mythic Keystones where you are pushing some difficult keys, you're looking at trash mobs, which have a multitude of difficult mechanics to deal with. You need kick rotations, you need stun rotations, you're going to be using things like knockback rotations, to deal with something like Necrotic, where every mob attack puts a healing receive debuff on the tank. You need to be using your knockbacks. You need to be kiting as the tank. Other classes need to be working with you to enable you to escape that. Just for example, you got all the multiple affixes, which you're going to be playing around as well. You need to plan your route, again, because you're battling that timer. You need to be going as quick as possible. You need to plan your route around using cooldowns at appropriate times. All this stuff, it adds up, I think, to make there's a lot more skill difficulty in BFA dungeons, without question. There's just far more mechanics. There's far more stuff for you to do as a class, as a spec. But that becomes at the higher level. I really don't know, though. I really don't know at what level you would rank Classic WoW dungeons. And I think it's even difficult to give a static ranking for it, right? Because if you think about, like, if we look at Mythic 0 dungeons, so just baseline Mythic dungeons in BFA today, I remember doing baseline Mythic dungeons the first 2 weeks of BFA, before Mythic Plus or the raids or anything released. And some of them were pretty hard because you're going into it in fresh leveling gear, and like we didn't bother with heroics or anything like that. We just went straight into mythics because we were a guild, right? Well, that stuff was pretty difficult. Whereas today, with all the gear that you have as an endgame character, or even the gear that you can quickly accrue within an hour or two of hitting max level, Mythic Zeros become a total joke. They're so much easier. So I think it becomes actually very difficult to give a fixed place for where the dungeons cross over, like at max level, simply because the level of power scaling that a character has in BFA is so much higher than it was back in Classic, right? Like a freshly dinged character, BFA week 1 compared to our characters now, the power level, the power difference is absolutely monumental. Whereas it won't be as big at all in Classic WoW. So I think it is difficult to say. I would guess that it would probably be somewhere between heroic and mythic dungeons. Well, to be honest, I don't know. I feel like some of the max level WoW dungeons, probably somewhere around the mythic level dungeon difficulty. I would say some of the questing ones, or most of the questing ones, are typically going to be somewhere around heroic difficulty. But it's difficult to say. That's something that I will give a better answer for when I actually go back and play those, right? When I actually go back and play them with a group of people, with the same group of people probably that I play Modern WoW with. Go back and compare and say, yes, this is how difficult these work, and it compares to this in the modern game. But I do think it's certainly the broad strokes of it is that Classic WoW, simpler mechanics, far simpler mechanics, but going at a slower pace. There's no timers, just a slower pace with careful, cautious pulls that make sense. Whereas modern WoW is going through as fast as you can, pulling as much as you can around your cooldowns, coordinating your cooldowns so that you can deal with all the multitude of mechanics that fights have. And I think that is a much more skill-based gameplay. I think both things have an advantage. You know, there's a very large appeal to going into something like Blackrock Depths. It's an adventure. It's a huge sprawling dungeon. It's an adventure. You know, getting your group together in town, flying over there because there's no summoning stone. That is a very special thing as well. So I think that is the big difference there, though. Diving into raids very quickly, because again, I feel a lot of this overlaps with the dungeons. Again, we've got the multiple difficulties. This time there's no infinitely scaling keystones, of course, but there is LF4, normal, heroic, and mythic. Unquestionably, when you look at mythic is a massive step beyond anything that was there in classic. It just very simply is. When you look at the mechanics in a fight like Mythic Jaina, or look at the ones that currently in Mythic Crucible of Storms as well, Mythic Unat, Mythic Restless Cabal, just the amount of mechanics, the level of play that is required, the level of coordination is so far above and beyond what you had in classic WoW. There really is almost no comparison. However, when it comes to, again, the biggest question though is, when it comes to the level of difficulty that does compare, where does it fall? I think that's the interesting thing to work out. LF4, certainly without question easier, and I very much suspect that normal raids in the modern WoW are much easier as well. I would expect that it's probably around heroic raiding, roughly speaking, is where the raid difficulty will lie. Though again, in terms of character progression, the difficulty that came up when we were talking about the dungeons also applies here, which is getting appropriately geared for Anchorage or Naxxramas versus getting appropriately geared for, let's say, going into Ashara's Eternal Palace, the next raid tier in modern WoW. Well, in modern WoW, I can level up a character in 8.2, get max level, get my guild to boost me through a few mythic dungeons, you know, do some world quests, do some war fronts, and within 2 or 3 weeks, do islands, spam up some Azerite, farm that up, and within 2 or 3 weeks, I can be as geared as my teammates and ready to go, absolutely no problem, into Mythic Raid. In Classic WoW, it's much more different. Obviously, it takes a lot more time to level up. It takes a lot more time to gear and go through those different raids to build up the appropriate gear that you need, whatever it might be, like the nature resist gear, the fire resist gear, frost resistance gear. That's stuff that actually matters. So it's very difficult to compare in terms of that particular level. I also think it would be very interesting to actually get to experience Classic WoW from the perspective of modern WoW, because of course modern WoW has had to adjust the way it designs raids to accommodate for the improving levels of the players. So like players simply know more than they did back then. I mean, the internet today, there's so much more information around and transmitted and shared today than there was back then. YouTube simply didn't really exist as a thing. I remember watching stuff on, what was it, Warcraft movies or something before. But there are guides easily accessible today, so much info. At a very real level, add-ons, weak auras. Right, weak auras are such a huge deal for us in Mythic raiding. I mean, it's a crucial part of how we handle the fights, and Blizzard designs fights around the assumption that people are going to be using these weak auras to handle the complexity. It's just going to be very interesting to see what they do. I would not be surprised. I would not be shocked, because Blizzard has even tussled with the idea of creating extra content at the end of Classic WoW, like perhaps more additional content than was there originally when people get to the end of it. I would not be shocked if, to add on to that, they also looked into an additional level of difficulty in the raids. I wouldn't be surprised to see that at all. I think that's something they could definitely do, because it is that, for a lot of people, it is that ultimate endgame content. And I'd very much suspect that if you get a mythic level raiding guild, that they're going to go in and absolutely destroy that content. It's not going to last that long at all, and that most of the difficulty will come simply from preparing for the raid bosses rather than actually fighting the raid bosses, like it is on the more difficult fights in modern WoW. So we'll see how that goes. In terms of PvP, I really don't know much about PvP, so I can't comment on it. As far as I know, there is no matchmaking back in Classic WoW. It's just fighting amongst people in your server or battle group. I don't know if there's even battle groups. I'm very uninformed on this, so I can't really say. Again, I would assume that with PvP, I mean, it's player versus player. So if you as a player, if players generally are at a higher skill level, well, that's on both sides of the coin. So I imagine PvP could basically remain just as difficult on both sides. I would suspect that Modern WoW might have, again, more complexity and depth to it with the rated battlegrounds and with Arena than Classic WoW with just random battlegrounds, as far as I'm aware. But I could be wrong in that, and please do let me know if I am. I love being told I'm wrong. But yes, anyway, that sums up that. That's my thoughts on the difficulty of Classic WoW. Like I said, I think it is a very different kind of difficulty. I think in terms of the leveling, it's unquestionably in pretty much every aspect harder in Classic WoW. I think when it comes to dungeons, again, I think the leveling dungeons, the base level, the simple level of the dungeons is higher than the lower levels of Modern WoW dungeons. However, at the higher levels, I think Modern WoW dungeons, in terms of the complexity, in terms of the skill-based play, will pull significantly ahead. The same is also true of raids. I think even perhaps more so true of raids. And that's my thoughts on that. Let me know what you guys think. And I hope you enjoy both games. I'm planning to play both of them. And I'll produce lots of content in the future for both. So see you all then. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.